Bonsoir.
Good evening once again.
Nous avions convié la réalisatrice du film.
We invited the filmmaker to come, but she said, I just can't. It's too difficult. I just can't relive those times again. I just can't see the film anymore. It's just too difficult for her. And what I wanted to say was that when we organize this festival, it's first and foremost for you and for us, but it's also to pay tribute to the bravery and commitment of all of those people who are pictured in these films. And I now have the pleasure of presenting Charles Glass, who covered the Middle East for many years. He's an American Syrian specialist living in London and Beirut since 1973. He was the chief editor of the Beirut and Middle East office of ABC News. And when I was a journalist in the United States, it's thanks to Charles Glass that I learned a great deal about the Middle East. Charles knows the Middle East extremely well, so I'm delighted to welcome him here tonight. And he will moderate the discussion tonight. The following panel, Charles is going to talk with Annie Sparrow, and I'll let him introduce her. Please, a round of applause for Charles Glass. I recommend his most recent book, which he wrote in 2016, which is called Syria Burning.
A short history of a catastrophe. J'aurais envie de dire qu'il manie l'euphémisme, il le fait évidemment délibérément.
That's a euphemism, of course, and he does that on purpose. Anyway, Charles Glass, you will be moderating this discussion with Annie Sparrow. You have the floor.
Can you all hear me? No, it's not working.
Sorry, yeah, change your mic. Sorry. Ma faute.
Is this one working? Yes, it is. I hope you'll forgive us for speaking in English, but if you heard me speak French, you would be appalled. This is Annie Sparrow, Dr. Annie Sparrow. Dr. Sparrow is a pediatric critical care specialist and public health expert who has worked with Human Rights Watch in Darfur, with CRS in complex emergencies in war-torn countries, and ran UNICEF's malaria program in Somalia. Since 2013, she has been working on Syria, documenting the systematic assaults on doctors, training Syrian doctors, publishing health outcomes of human rights violations. And she also teaches war medicine at Mount Sinai Hospital in New York. She's here tonight. She knows some of the people involved in this film and is in regular touch with many of the people who have suffered, as these people have suffered, during the Syrian war. I want to begin our conversation. I'm just here to ask a few questions. Dr. Sparrow is here to speak, and then you'll be asking questions when I run out of them, which will probably be fairly soon. Dr. Sparrow, could I just ask, first of all, for your reaction to this, what I think was an extremely powerful and moving film?
Sure. I have to say, I was actually dreading this film. And I say that because I was expecting it to be like a lot of other Syrian films, which show a great deal of brutality and blood and death. And I've seen a lot of that. I see it usually every day. And I loved it. Maybe love isn't quite the right word. But I started watching it last night, and I also sent it to two of my Syrian friends to say, please watch it, tell me what you think as a Syrian. So I found it very different, and it presents a point of view that you really don't hear very often, and it tells the story of the revolution in a way that most people either don't know about or have forgotten that it began as a revolution, and that
it began originally as a demand for reform. The first demonstrations in Daraa were asking for reform. They were very modest, the early demands. The demand for regime change came a little bit later.
Yes, and I mean, when we look back and remember that, I remember it. When I hear my Syrian friends talk about it, there were three things that really struck me, and that when they talk about the word freedom, which they were demanding as they moved towards that, and that conversation with the man before the judge, and he's saying, and they say, well, define freedom. And this is the conversation I've had with so many Syrian friends, and he says, I can't tell you what it is because none of us have ever tasted it. And one of my friends said last night, and often over the years, because when I started working on this war, which was only end of 2012, none of us expected it to go on this long. I just thought it would fill in a year in my life. And now all my friends are terrorists or Syrians, depending on your point of view. But Russia said, we didn't know what freedom was. If you live under oppression, you lose a sense of the meaning of the word because you don't know anything else. And we didn't know whether we were fighting for freedom of speech or freedom of religion or freedom from poverty. We thought we would just have to fight for it and then figure out what it meant afterwards.
The other word that was used early in the film, as often as freedom, was dignity. People in Syria felt that their dignity was not respected by their rulers. And did you take that away as well?
Yes, very much so.
And the combination of freedom and dignity for these young people who seem, although it's not spelled out, seem to be upper middle class, alert to the Western world, young people, idealistic, reminding me of some of my own generation of anti-war protesters against the Vietnam War in the United States and here in France. But it seems that these young people didn't know where this was going to lead. And in a sense, were very disillusioned by the end, because the young woman who was filming and who wanted her political freedom saw herself losing all her social freedoms when they say, and if you want to film here, don't send a woman, send a man. So that disillusion must have been overpowering for them.
I think there's a great deal of pride still that they had the courage to tell a dictator when to go. But there's a great deal of guilt on behalf of those who are, the millions who are now living in abject poverty and fear and this dreadful daily danger. Because what the film doesn't show you is the last 2 years of the Syrian conflict, where we've seen a total escalation of the fighting, and with every single type of weapon used, whether it's the barrel bombs, the missiles, the rockets, the shelling, the chemical attacks, even naval mines are used. Everything, incendiary weapons, cluster bombs, vacuum bombs, everything except nuclear arms, practically. And the film doesn't show that. Their dignity is kind of, again, it's like you can feel it when you don't have it. And I used to struggle, I still struggle to explain Syria to people and what it's like to grow up under a dictatorship. You heard them, saying down with Hafez, because of course they still blame the father for the son. And they described to me things like having to go to school every day with a picture of Assad on your textbooks. And I imagine that would be like for us, because now I'm forced to live in America, as I married an American, having to have a screensaver of Trump. And if you didn't, that was
Well, wait, that may happen.
Well, this is how it starts, Charles, isn't it? Yeah, this is how it starts.
No, I remember when the Arab Spring originated in Tunisia and then moved to Tahrir Square in Cairo. Again, this theme of dignity came up. But I think this could have happened in any, and indeed every Arab country, because every single Arab country is a dictatorship. No Arab dictator respects the dignity of his people or allows them freedom. In some cases, a small degree of social freedom, but in no case, political freedom. Is Assad any worse than any other Arab dictator?
hard for me to say in that my experience is with Syria and not with Iraq, for example, or Egypt. But when you talked earlier about the younger generation, and the film alludes to this, Hussam describes people pretending to be happy, but hiding the sadness inside their hearts. And some of my friends from Aleppo described this to me because they would feel that. They would spend the first half of the month trying to earn enough money, knowing that they would spend the second half of the month in debt. They didn't have time to think about whether or not they were happy or satisfied. But they also, like people in Aleppo were a bit, slower than the other cities. It began in Daraa. Homs was the center. There were a lot of demonstrations in Damascus. And it didn't really start in Aleppo until about the spring of 2012. And they described, though, the humiliation, living with the humiliation of the 1978 to 1982 uprising of the Muslim Brotherhood then, and being completely and utterly crushed by Hafez then, completely. And I say that because a lot of people also ask me, well, all the talk is about ISIS, ISIS, ISIS. And so about 2 years ago, I asked one of my colleagues from Deir ez-Zor, I said, well, what's worse, ISIS or Assad? And he said, it's the wrong question. I learned a lot through Syria. I'm so wrong a lot of the time. And he described to me that he had just found out that his uncle was dead. And he said, I didn't even know I had an uncle. His mother had just told him because after 1982, everyone who was against Assad was either, all their activists were either killed or incarcerated or exiled. And
many of the prisoners in Tadmor prison were murdered in the prison as well.
So there were already, there's already hundreds of thousands of people, a few 100,000 people in the prison left over from that era. But his uncle had been amongst those activists, and the regime knew that he hadn't been killed. He wasn't in exile and he wasn't in prison. So he lived in an attic for 30 years, and no one knew except his daughter and his wife.
I see.
And you see, that's the level of humiliation that they were forced to live under, and oppression. And so living under that type of humiliation for 30 years then meant they can't afford to give that up now. They desperately are craving the type of dignity we take for granted.
It doesn't look good for them, whichever side wins the war.
No. I mean, where we are now makes 2014 look like good times. Really, and that's where in 2013 it was dreadful. I've never seen anything as obscene as the chemical massacre in Damascus with the bodies of newly dead children. And it's got a great deal worse since then. And as we know, when the Russians entered the war in the end of September 2015, we've seen a lot more bloodshed. I've spent the last few weeks counting the numbers of doctors killed and medics killed as war crimes. We now know that there's 814 doctors that have been killed in acts of war alone, because doctors are also considered terrorists. I'm also a terrorist in Syria because I work with doctors who are helping civilians, from the beginning, civilians who are injured.
From a medical point of view, Syria is in very dire shape. I think more than 2/3 of the medical personnel who were there before the war are no longer in the country, either dead or have fled. And the population is very badly served by the remaining medical services. And this is a humanitarian catastrophe for the country. I mean, a function of the political crisis that led to the war, but still something that isn't being dealt with at the moment.
The lifespan in Syria has dropped from 71 years in 2011 to 55 years now. And that is that's just unheard of. It's radical. I mean, you expect it to drop in wars because of but not to that extent. And it's dropped for men and women. And So that for men, the average age now is 48 years. For women, it's now 68 years. And the average is 55. So that is actually a tangible marker of the public health catastrophe. And what the other thing the film doesn't really show you, and that we don't talk about very much, is what's going on in government areas. And that's not a picnic either. Sure, they're not being bombed every day, but even those who have money are struggling to put just one type of food on the table, whether it's eggs or cheese, and meat is just history. So in Damascus even, they only have electricity for 2 hours a day.
One of the things that isn't in the film, probably because it's not part of their story, and I don't fault the film for this, is the sheer generosity of the Syrian people themselves. I've been to towns and villages and in Damascus where people have taken in families, some they're related to and some they don't even know, into their own houses, or have provided them with space in their gardens, and have given half their wages to other families. And this is something I rarely see, and I've covered wars all over the world, unfortunately. I rarely see this. I mean, you do see some of the kindness and generosity in the film in general, but this aspect of it is something worth bearing in mind, of how much this society has survived despite its politics, and how urgent it is to end this conflict one way or another. It doesn't seem, however, that the outside powers who are fueling it, whether the Russians and the Iranians on one side, or the Americans, British, French, Qataris, Turks, and Saudis on the other side, they're not doing anything to bring this to a head. They have pro forma meetings every so often in this city, but they're not serious. Nobody has decided that this game is up, and so they provide the arms to perpetuate this crime.
I think Syrians are extraordinary, and that level of hospitality I haven't really experienced before. When I first started going and working there, I would usually lose weight. You work all day. It's called the Syrian diet, And then as I made friends, then I would start to be, invited always into people's homes, and that was great. I'm always hungry. I'd love to eat, and my husband got happier because I'd come home heavier than when I left, which was great. No one in Syria would go hungry. It's not like there's a shortage of food. They all share it. The fact that they have survived this long is testimony to the reach, the depth, the dimensions of, I don't want to call it necessarily kinship or community, but when you see the Muslims and the Christians, chanting together, they still are like that. And I can't imagine another war that I've worked on another place where I would see this strength and courage at this stage, even with you see some of the movement towards extremism, but the vast majority are not like that. They're incredibly civilized, and I can only imagine that reflects millennia of sophistication. And
yes. They make us look like barbarians in that sense, yes. Now, I want to open up to any and all of you who have questions for Dr. Sparrow. Someone will bring you a microphone. You can ask it in English, French, Arabic, Armenian, Italian, any language you like, and there'll be someone here who can explain it to me.
I actually have one quickly to Dr. Sparrow. You dealing with the consequences on health of those human rights violations. Can you go into that aspect? So not only do we see what assault on human dignity is from the repression, but if you could tell us what you actually do in your field and what is the additional suffering from the Syrian population given the consequences of the human rights violation, torture, epidemics, et cetera, et cetera.
I started, I wanted to look at Syria from the point of view of what happens to your health when your human rights are violated. And I'd wanted to do this for a long time because a long time ago I worked in Australian detention camps where people were forced to live under very punitive conditions, without privacy, without doors, being force-fed, even pills were put into their mouths. At the end of the year that I spent working there off and on, people were sewing up their lips, even children, because it was the only piece of control they had left. And I watched children regressing, 8-year-olds wetting the bed and being forced to wear nappies, adolescents mutilating themselves, and young kids just not developing. So looking at dignity, you could see this is what happens. And then in Darfur, I would see really malnourished kids, and eating, food alone is not enough. No one wants to eat when they've just seen their mother being gangbanged and raped and, their father shot. And it's that, I used to think we'd probably do better as Human Rights Watch if we went straight up to the Action Contre la Faim tent and, just interviewed everybody there, because you will know that they have suffered terrible human rights violations. So that's where I wanted to go to Syria and try to look at that relationship. Because health is not only a great barometer of dignity, but it's also something that everyone can understand. And so when polio re-emerged, that was a testimony, a barometer of the war. And the regime tried to cover it up, saying it's because of the war, blah, blah, blah. Vaccinations were 99% before the war, which is absolute rubbish. There's no place in the world which has a vaccination rate of 99%. It's a bit like an election under a dictatorship, right? 99% of the people voted for us. No place. And what had happened in reality was that vaccinations were withheld from politically unsympathetic areas. So if you were living in Deir ez-Zor, your kids just weren't getting vaccinated. And that was just one of the many reasons people were actually demonstrating. They were fed up with having these type of things withheld. So that was an example of how the previous, the dictatorship meets conflict, and then you get polio. And blaming on the war sounds easy, but we had 8 years of war in Iraq, and there wasn't any polio there. So it's an easier way to understand, and I confess I use it very deliberately because we can all get behind child health, and people still believe in it, but no one really wants to talk about, I don't know, old men with prostate disease, even though it's very important, but no one wants to talk about it, but we can still talk about children, so you have to kind of be smart about advocacy. And then since the polio, we've seen so many other diseases where, I was saving Syria. I wanted to go to Syria with my husband, because it's always seemed to me the most ancient and beautiful and sophisticated places, and I hadn't been before the war, and then this happened. And what I also found as a doctor, that although I went to start looking at people's health, people started asking me, do you know what this is? And I would say, well, that looks like polio to me. And that looks like typhoid, and this is TB. And I mean, TB they had before the war, but what I found that every single place I'd worked in the war, I'd worked around the world, whether it was Afghanistan or Haiti or Somalia or first world hospitals in Australia and the UK and so forth, every single disease is now in Syria. Everything from the first world, or the heart disease, or the cancer, everything from infertility to celiac disease, and then everything from the developing world, every nasty infectious disease, every single tropical disease you can think of, they have. So everything I'd learned from polio in Afghanistan and leishmaniasis in Somalia was suddenly useful. So then I got asked to start training Syrian doctors, which I do with great honor and pride. And the first training I do remember, January 2014. And I said to the doctors and nurses, I am in awe of you because you are working on the front lines of the worst war I've ever seen. And they said, well, what do you mean? Because from their perspective, if you're not given enough information about the outside world, they couldn't even understand that it was actually the worst war with the worst weaponry that now causes the worst trauma. I've never seen such terrible trauma, and they are forced to learn on the run.
I think we're being urged to take another
question.
question.
Very long answer.
The next question is, yes, please.
Samaj, wait. this is not an overly technical or legal question, but your response to the bombing of hospitals and the specific killing of doctors, this is supposed to be a war crime, and how do you see some kind of accountability for these things going on?
The Assad government regime is using a total war strategy. And here we are in Geneva, where we talk about the Geneva Conventions, the laws of war, driven by the need to provide medical care during wartime, whether to combatants or patients, civilians, and the right of those combatants and civilians to receive it. So the targeting of hospitals and the execution, incarceration, torture of doctors, which started first of all in Daraa in March. The first doctor was executed in March in Daraa in 2011, is a way of, I call it the weaponization of healthcare. It's using people's health needs for health as a weapon against them. So the regime keeps on targeting hospitals until it's destroyed them. And it's now destroyed too many hospitals to count. I have a long, long list of them. In Idlib, they targeted hospitals in Sarakeb, for example. And then you remember when Idlib was taken by the opposition in March of 2015, on the 29th of March. The very first thing that the regime did was to bomb the National Hospital and the Red Crescent Hospital. So these are war crimes. There's no doubt about it. There are now 814 doctors that we know of killed in acts of war. And what is encouraging about the UN General Assembly resolution in December was that there was a consensus on a process to appoint a special prosecutor to start investigating, repairing cases for these war crimes to be prosecuted. And this is the thing that, airstrikes, only the Syrian government and the Russian government have air capacity. So anything that's been, any hospital that's been targeted in an airstrike, that's Syria or Russia. That we know for sure. Neither ISIS nor any opposition group has the air capacity.
I'm a bit more cynical about the accountability than Dr. Sparrow is. I remember the Israelis in 1982 bombed every single hospital in West Beirut in their onslaught on the Palestinians. There was no accountability. The Israelis are still bombing hospitals in Gaza. There is no accountability. The Americans bombed Médecins Sans Frontières hospitals. The Saudis bombed hospitals in Yemen. There will be no accountability, and I doubt there will be in Syria either. And that is a tragedy. We're taking the next question, please. One more question. I think this is either the final or the penultimate question, depending on how long the answer is.
Tout d'abord,
Okay, we have 2 minutes, sorry.
Pour vous remercier pour toute cette
I'd just like to thank you for this evening. I've learned a great deal.
La question s'adresse à vous.
I have a question
Quelle est la
for you.
dimension
What is the
géopolitique
geopolitical dimension
derrière toute cette histoire?
of this
Parce qu'il n'y a pas que la
story?
Russie.
Because there
Il y
isn't
a
just
aussi les
Russia
États-Unis, il y a la
involved.
France,
There's also
il y a
United States,
l'Angleterre.
France.
On a vu
Great
très
Britain.
bien en Libye, en
We
Irak,
saw in Libya, we saw in Iraq
qu'un
already
responsable de crimes contre
that
l'humanité,
there were crimes
comme
against
George
humanity
Bush,
committed.
s'est
And
contenté
George
de
Bush
dire que c'était pas vrai, qu'il y avait des armes de destruction
lied
massive,
about
et il est
weapons of mass
dans
destruction.
son ranch au fond
And
des
he remains
États-Unis.
in his ranch
Rien s'est passé.
in the United
Parce
States,
qu'il y a toutes
safe and
sortes de
sound.
terrorisme, et un
There
terrorisme
are
d'État,
many types of terrorism. One form
évidemment
is
qu'il y avait
state
des
terrorism. Of
injustices,
course,
il y a un
there are
contexte
injustices,
terrible,
and there are
des
terrible
dictatures dans
situations,
toute cette
dictatorships
région du Moyen-Orient.
in many countries around the region. What
La
is your
question
question, please?
géopolitique.
The
Quelle est la
geopolitical
place des États-Unis
aspect.
derrière
What is the place
la
of the United
France?
States behind all of
Si
this?
nous nous
France.
rappelons la Libye, nous
Remember
rappelons
Libya.
bien toutes les
And
manipulations en Égypte,
you remember
et
the
finalement,
manipulation
l'Irak,
in Egypt
c'est un
and in
crime
Iraq
contre l'humanité.
and the crimes against humanity there.
All I can answer to that is the only place or the only thing that's possible I can see is solidarity. Nothing's going to happen politically. There will be no military intervention. One of the things that this film shows better than any film I've seen is that there is still more life than death in Syria. It's a film about life. There's a lot of death. But Syrians didn't go out in the streets in 2011 to figure out all these different ways to die. They went out to find out ways to live. And I think now, you know, when we're talking about feasible options, we have to support Syrian NGOs directly who are still there doing it, looking after each other, the doctors, the healthcare, the paramedics, and we can stand in solidarity still.
I wish we could discuss this much greater length, but I believe we're out of time, and I want to thank everyone. I want to thank Dr. Sparrow, first of all, for coming and watching this film with us, and I want to thank all of you for coming to listen to it. Thank you.